Our speaker today, as you know, is Gerald Ranck. It has been our good fortune to have had Jerry as our musical director for the past 29 years. And it's been my personal pleasure to work with him. Jerry has delighted and inspired us with the breadth and depth of his musical talents. He's generously brought us exciting concerts with his Strathmere Ensemble. He has inspired us with his keen intellect when giving us many platform addresses that have analyzed important topics. Jerry's talk today is entitled Taking Renewed Aim at the Second Amendment, Gun Violence in the Wake of Newtown. Jerry? Jerry was busy working on the harpsichord yesterday, and it did a little number on his back, so he's going to sit just to be sure that he's good and comfortable.
Welcome all my subjects. Today I'm going to give you, can you hear me?
Yeah.
A big talk and a little talk. And trying to figure a way to separate the two, I was reminded way back when I first started here, WQXR used to record our Sunday morning talks for subsequent broadcasts. Well, this meant that they had to be very carefully calibrated as to time. My dear, dear departed friend, our dear departed friend, Matthew Spetter, didn't see time the same way we did. And he talked as long as he felt he needed to. And it always seemed to be just right to me, but it was way beyond the radio time. He came up with a wonderful, artful way of getting around it. He would speak to the time limit, and then he would get a twinkle in his eye. And I was close enough because I was on stage, I saw it. And he would say, now it's time to say goodbye to our radio audience. And then he would blithely proceed for another 10, 15, 20 minutes, however. So when you hear me say that, you'll know it's one or the other. Okay. Guns are an abomination. Free from fear of gun owners' retaliation at the polls, I would favor making handguns illegal and requiring licenses for hunting rifles. Any guesses as to who said that? Richard M. Nixon. Secondly, the sentence that causes all the trouble. The Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. In 2002, the filmmaker activist Michael Moore released a provocative, scathing documentary on guns and violence in America called Bowling for Columbine. Among the more surrealistic episodes in that film is the following. In an idyllic, thoroughly conventional-looking small town in Michigan, Mr. Moore and his crew encounter a sign in a bank window offering a free gun as a gift for opening a new account. Unable to resist the temptation, Mr. Moore enters the bank to inquire about what he clearly regards as a bizarre offer. He asks to open an account so he can claim his prize, which turns out to be a quite handsome, loaded rifle. He submits to several pedestrian questions, constituting what the bank calls a background check. Questions such as, what race are you? Or, have you ever been adjudicated as mentally defective? What would your answer be if you were asked? Having passed this rigorous training, he is informed that he may choose his free gun from among 450 kept in the bank vault. Finally, rifle in hand, he turns to the bank manager and drops the bomb he's been waiting to drop all along. With a completely straight face, he says, "Don't you think it's dangerous to give people guns in a bank?" To many of us northeastern urban dwellers, this entire scene is wrapped in unreality. But what I find truly surrealistic is the utterly bland, Fargo-like, matter-of-fact attitudes of the bank employees when confronted with Mr. Moore's skepticism, as if to say, what's the problem? It's only a gun. There definitely is more than one America out there, and perhaps more than two. Do the membership of the National Rifle Association unanimously espouse the shrill anti-government paranoia, as Mr. Wayne LaPierre obviously does as its spokesman? Or is there a different species of NRA members from Mr. LaPierre, solid, law-abiding, responsible citizens who cherish their constitutional right to bear arms, but who are embarrassed by fanatics waving rifles in the air and shouting from my cold, dead hands? A recent survey taken of NRA membership showed that a clear-cut majority favored increased background checks. Indeed, 6 years ago, Mr. Wayne LaPierre petitioned Congress to expand background checks. Also, a clear-cut majority of NRA members favored more advanced safety features on guns, even if it made them more expensive. Well, in the wide diversity of America, indeed, we find that the overwhelming majority of gun owners are safe, responsible, cautious, and prudent. That the last thing on their minds would be ever pointing a gun at another person, let alone firing it. Whose interests in firearms range from collecting, target shooting, hunting, etc. There are also those of us, however, who exemplify altogether darker motives for possessing firearms. Government-hating, paranoid, violent, neo-militiamen who long for the coming Armageddon, when the firepower of their fanatical brethren confronts the jackbooted thugs of the forces of the federal government. We must also contend with a substantially well-armed criminal class, which threatens life and liberty and is always with us at one time or another, to one extent or another. Also, we have to deal with gang violence, racial strife, and the tragedies that strike us with special poignance. First, mass killings. Killings for the purpose of killing only, and especially when it involves, as it did at Sandy Hook, young children. And lastly, there are those of us, many of us I trust in this room, who are opposed to the proliferation of firearms, period, or in varying degrees. Some of us urge stricter safety laws, tighter registration. Some urge that the gun laws already on the books be more stringently enforced, and so on. So at the outset, I read to you the text of the Second Amendment, the source of all our troubles here. When I first considered talking about this, I had a simple and what I considered a definitive lock on this amendment from the Bill of Rights. Guns are permitted for militias, and for that reason and that reason alone, the people shall have the right to keep and bear arms. Simple, straightforward, right? How come, I thought, not only pro-gun advocates, but also gun control liberals all misread this perfectly logical sentence in one way or another? The typical liberal position usually starts with, we don't want to challenge or interfere with the rights of lawful gun owners and the Second Amendment, but. And after thinking about it, I have to admit the Second Amendment is not, after all, so simple or straightforward. That in fact, there are two distinct and mutually exclusive interpretations that are equally compelling on their own terms. The question, in my mind, hinges on whether the Second Amendment confers an individual right, that is, private citizens may own guns, or a collective right, the people considered as a whole and not individuals. Now, I know that 4 years ago, the Supreme Court, in its infinite, for want of a better word, wisdom, came down on the side of individual rights, but with limitations, which they delightfully declined to specify. So, I want to take a look briefly at both sides of this argument, even though, in a certain sense, legally it's been settled. First, we'll give the enemy team first crack. Favor of individual rights. Perhaps the most persuasive argument in favor of this interpretation is the language of the bill itself. The first clause, the militia clause, is a statement of implicit opinion, faintly subjunctive in tone. You could put it this way. We seem to think that a well-regulated militia might be essential to the security of a free state and conceivably capture the true flavor of the clause. But when the declarative sentence follows, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, we are no longer in opinion land. We are in fact land. The direct kinetic force of this statement is unmistakable. Indeed, James Madison, its author, originally placed that statement first. This is what he said. This is the first version of the Second Amendment. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. A well-armed and well-regulated militia being the best security of a free country. In his notes for his speech to Congress, urging them to support constitutional amendments, he referred to this and other articles of the proposed Bill of Rights as relating, quote, first and foremost, to private rights, end quote. Indeed, as can be clearly perceived, the central focus of the first 10 constitutional amendments is on the individual, giving him specific but reasonably limited rights. The inclusion of the militia clause in the Second Amendment was principally a compromise, which appeased the fear of the anti-federalists who feared that their rights could be trampled and not defended properly and sustained by a central authority, that is, to wit, the federal government. Professor Leonard Levy of Yale expresses the view that serving in a militia is not a right so much as it is an obligation, And if the Second Amendment were only concerned with the militia, it would not have been elevated to constitutional status. Two other points for the individual view. Pennsylvania, which originated the phrase keep and bear arms, had no militia at the time of ratification. Therefore, the amendment they ratified had to clearly represent to them the expression of an individual right to keep and bear arms. Second, many militias required their soldiers to provide their own arms, as per English common law. How could they do so if the Constitution did not permit them to keep and bear arms individually? That's the individual argument. Here is the collective argument. As in our analysis of the individual rights, much of the argument favoring a collective view of the right to bear arms hinges on language. Specifically, the philological history of the phrase, keep and bear arms. In Gary Will's book, A Necessary Evil, he clearly lays out the problem for those seeking justification of individual gun rights. He says, and I quote, "If they, the NRA, are inadequate as historians, they are ludicrous as philologists, as one can see from the way they treat the term bear arms. Don Cates writes in the Michigan Law Review that the amendment clearly refers to personal weapons since bear means carry, and a person cannot carry certain military weapons, such as artillery. This gets things exactly backward," says Professor Wells. Bear arms refers to military service, which is why the plural is used, based on the Greek hapla ferein and the Latin arma fere. One does not bear arm or bear an arm. The word means etymologically equipment. William Shakespeare called war itself arms, and Hamlet's famous soliloquy includes the phrase, "Take arms against a sea of troubles." That is clearly a military metaphor. Moreover, when the Senate discussed and subsequently rejected the inclusion of the phrase common defense after bear arms in the text of the amendment, it was thought by pro-gun enthusiasts that since common defense clearly invoked a military connotation, the rejection of that phrase confirms that keep and bear arms refers to private rights. Thus have they in mind a positive interpretation by citing a negative. That is, a phrase that ultimately isn't there. It doesn't exist. But they took it out of the ether and put it back in, saying, this will justify our argument. It's sort of the same thing they're doing today with Benghazi, but we won't get into that. Now let me see where I am here. Finally, Professor Wills opines that because the Constitutional Convention reversed the order of Madison's original language, they were signaling a preferential emphasis on the military or militia section of the argument. I came up with an argument of my own, which I haven't found anywhere. It's a very lawyerly argument. The phrase, the people, the right of the people. The people is a collective noun, as in we, the people. Yes? Without the word the, then it would say the right of people to bear arms, and you would clearly have a case for individual rights. I hope there are no lawyers in the room. This is why people hate lawyers. Okay? They dream up stuff like this. But it is a compelling argument. it seems to me. So there we have it, a semantic Donnybrook as to what the Second Amendment actually means rather than what it merely says. And as we know, the Supreme Court has told us they've come down in favor of individual rights with limitations. Professor Lawrence Tribe of Harvard agrees with this interpretation, for reasons known only to him. Therefore, if we thought that the individual rights to bear arms prevailed, those of us who wished our society to be rid of guns altogether would be forced to seek the repeal of the Second Amendment. This is what I would call the Erewhon approach, after Samuel Butler's famous novel about utopia called Erewhon, which is nowhere spelled backwards. Amending the United States Constitution or repealing an existing amendment has been made a very, very tall order by the framers. 2/3 of Congress, both houses, savor that phrase for a minute. 2/3 majority of both houses of a Congress that cannot agree whether the sun comes up every morning. Plus, there's more. We have to have ratification by 2/3 majorities of 3/4 of the state legislatures. A tall order indeed. Given the current political climate, I think you can pretty much agree this is out of the question. I think it's out of the question permanently. The thought of the United States government striking down one of the sacred first 10 amendments of the Bill of Rights to the Constitution would set such a terrible precedent. It's unthinkable. It's politically unthinkable. It's never going to happen. It's never going to happen. However, let's say for the sake of argument, we do repeal it. That means that what is legal on Monday is a felony on Wednesday. We have 300 million guns in circulation that we know of in a population of over 300 million people, which would mean the Federal Justice Department would have on day one approximately 300 million felonies to prosecute. This is if they could actually round up the guns and find them. It reminds me of the Volstead Act. Some of you around here remember the Volstead Act. We all called it prohibition. And not only did it not make things better, it made things worse. A black market gun culture already in place, well in place, would be immeasurably empowered, as was bootlegging during Prohibition. And as usual, criminals would be criminals, doing their thing. So it is fairly clear that this approach not only solves nothing, but makes it worse. The Volstead Act, I called it fiasco, lasted 13 years, and it was the easiest constitutional amendment to repeal in American history. It literally vanished. It had virtually unanimous support. Now, I don't know who said this. I think it was Ambrose Bierce, but something tells me it might have been someone like William Randolph Hearst. There are lies, there are damn lies, and then there are statistics. However, I want to give you some statistics briefly here that we can't laugh at. In Bowling for Columbine, Michael Moore made a big point of comparing the number of gun homicides in developed countries. I looked up revisions, because Bowling for Columbine is over 10 years old. At the bottom of the list, Luxembourg and Iceland, 0. This does not include suicide. This is only homicide. Germany, 269. France, 255. Canada, 144. The UK, this surprised me, 14. Australia, 59. Japan, 47. The United States came in third, behind South Africa and Colombia. South Africa last year had 31,918 homicides with guns. Colombia was not far behind. The United States, 11,129. Now, to put it into Sandy Hook terms, first of all, currently, if you do the math, the following appalling statistics apply. Every day, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, every week, every month of a year, 8 more people die of gunfire than were killed at Sandy Hook. Every day. Every 3 months or so, more die from gunfire than were killed on 9/11. Let that hang in the air for a minute. So what to do? We can't repeal the Second Amendment. We can't take everybody's gun away from them. It's not possible. Even if we couldn't do it. I have another statistic to add to this. Automobile accidents. How many do you think there are in this country every year? Deaths. 55,000. Give or take. I do not know of any lobbying force that is petitioning the government to please not take away our cars. I don't know of any government, I don't know of any lobbying force that has any complaint about auto owners of obeying a myriad of government intrusions into their right to own and drive a car. Simple. Take guns and treat them like cars. License. You have to have a license to operate. You must register. You have to qualify for a license. You have to have your firearm inspected on a regular basis. You must insure it. That alone would ameliorate an enormous problem. I can't really, because there's not enough time, talk about mental health. But we all realize how important this is. We all agree people who are mentally ill should not have guns. That's unanimous. What we need to agree on is how to treat people with mental illness so that it will not occur to them to go for a gun, to solve a frustration, an offense, or settle any kind of dispute. But we can't talk about everything. And safety. Automobiles are required to maintain stringent safety standards. I understand there is a device that can be put into a firearm that will contain your DNA or your DNA or whoever. And that gun will only operate if you fire it. No one else. Stuff like that will cost $5 a weapon. $5 a weapon. These are all things we can do. And finally, we need to rely on ourselves. And you hear this so often here. The bottom line is us. We get what we deserve. If we want a better government, if we want fewer gun deaths, less violence, it's really up to all of us. It's not like the comedian who said when he first saw Smokey the Bear say, "Only you can prevent forest fires," and went, "Me? Only me?" No, it's all of us together. working together. Gun safety is not achieved by suppression and denial, but by immersion in information and using that information to change attitudes. I have 2 words for you: cigarette smoking. How attitudes can dramatically change national habits. We need to be weaned in a perfect world from our Congress needs to be weaned from the suffocating influence of the National Rifle Association and move to consider rational, reasonable, and effective limits on a given constitutional freedom, rather than seeking irresponsibly to open a limitless floodgate of guns on one hand or ruthlessly emasculate the Bill of Rights on the other. We've got to find common ground. Well, depending on Congress, does not seem to be a promising prospect. Given the current group, Republican and Democrat, and these are my words and I'm only responsible for them, so don't send your letters to anyone but me. A bunch of fat, overpaid, underqualified, corrupt political whores, 80% of whom become lobbyists once they leave, often for causes they opposed while they were in Congress. This is not a good group. Okay? And the president, whom I admire very, very much, but who apparently, having a bill to propose to the Congress, supported by 93% of the American public, cannot muster 60 votes in the U.S. Senate. So, I'm going to quit now. I've said enough. From a Sandy Hook parent, we'll say it all. She was asked, are you afraid that the passage of time will lessen the intensity of feeling about this horrible tragedy that happened in Connecticut? And she said the following: I feel that this event just happened minutes ago, and yet it's been years since I've seen my son. Surely we as citizens of this country cannot continue to turn our backs on the nightmares of these and thousands of other parents simply for the idolatry of a constitutional amendment.